Well, I've shot this video like 3 times already, so here's hoping this one isn't a complete clusterfuck. I wanted to do a more impromptu type video because I'm working on samples and there's a particular process I want to do that I think is really useful for sound design purposes. The samples are a bunch of percussion instruments on which I'm rubbing friction mallets, and they kind of sound like this. That's a timpani. Here's a sizzle cymbal. Here's a snare drum. And a china cymbal. So as you can hear, they're all very complex, and while they're great for things like transitions or special effects, I want to be able to include a couple examples that provide a more consonant harmonic place to come from. So if you want to use them as like leads or bass instruments or pads, something that's a little more cohesive tonally than what these offer. To do that, we're going to take a look at this specific timpani sample. So just looking at the spectrum analysis, I'll throw up a screenshot of it. You can see there's a lot of harmonics going on, which is cool for texture. Not so great when you start stacking them on top of each other. It can get very cluttered very fast. In order to increase the tonal quality of this sample, there's a few ways we could go about it, and they fall into what I'm going to call 3 major buckets: additive synthesis, spectral processing, and modulation. First, taking a look at additive synthesis. One of the ways people like to do this is by making use of what are called resonant filters. So if we have our original sample, let's loop it for a second and let's identify where the fundamental frequency of this sample is. So you can see those 3 prominent peaks at the bottom of the spectrum. It's identifying the second order harmonic as kind of the focal point, which is a C sharp 2. But there's actually the original fundamental is 1 octave below that, C sharp 1. So knowing that, we can first of all tune the sample so it will be more sonorous with other instruments. So I've got a quick sampler loaded with the sample in here. The root key set to C sharp 1 because that's our original fundamental, minus 20 cents because it was a little out of tune. And so now, if we look at the spectrum analyzer, you can see that the primary fundamental is hovering around C notes if we play a C on the keyboard. Okay, so we've got our sample tuned. Now we're going to add our resonant filter. We're going to open Pro Q just for demonstration purposes. Pro Q has a nice little thing where you can switch to notes on the keyboard rather than look at frequency-based nodes. If we play middle C, you see our first fundamental is middle C, so we'll go ahead and add a node there. Create a very sharp peak by increasing the Q factor and start slowly raising this until we hear that fundamental start to ring. So there, we can hear the filters resonating, essentially creating like a small feedback circuit. So we're reinforcing the fundamental with this. We can then, if we want to make something more consonant, focus on utilizing the overtone series. So if you're unfamiliar, I'll throw up a little graphic, but the overtone series is a naturally occurring series of overtones on any fundamental sound, any fundamental pitch, which you hear in an acoustic situation or an acoustic environment. So the first order harmonic, meaning the note that sounds above the fundamental pitch, is 1 octave above. So we'll add another node there, set a high Q factor, raise the peak up a little bit. Above that is a 5th, so we'll go to G, and we will add another node there with a high Q factor. And above that is the 4th, so we'll add the F above that. Same thing, high Q, add a peak. And then for last, we will add a major third, which is further up on the overtone series. And now what you notice as we're going through this, and I'm calling out these notes, is that Western harmony is very arranged around the overtone series. All of the intervals that you would find in a major scale are part of the overtone series. So that's kind of how those systems originated. But now that we've added all of these nodes, when we play a C note on the keyboard, you can hear there's all this additional resonance, which is more pronounced now than the noisy aspects of the original sample. And with this set, you can keep adding nodes, keep continuing emphasizing overtone series. You can use odd or even harmonics, which is another topic we're not going to get into. And what's cool is that by altering the amplitude of these filter nodes, you get very different timbres to come out. Getting kind of irritating, but you see the point. And that's what gives most sounds their timbral quality. So the reason a violin sounds like a violin when it plays the same C3 note is because of the overtones and upper harmonics that the instrument naturally creates when you sound that particular pitch. This is great for processing individual pitches. If I wanted to then extrapolate this and turn it into a sampler instrument, what I would do is export this particular sample at that note C3, throw it into a sampler and stretch it across the keyboard. You could create the same nodes for different notes. You'd have to obviously change them to reflect the octave, fifth, fourth, and third relationships that we had for this original setup with C. But you can create a pretty convincing instrument, but it takes a lot of work to reset these nodes every single time. If we want to export out like a different note, higher or lower than this, we'd have to change the frequency position of each of these nodes to reflect that change in pitch. So another way to go about this is through key tracking filters. And I'm going to use phase plant in this example because it's just really exceptionally good at doing this. But the idea here is that we have a modulator that's taking information from our MIDI keyboard and moving filter cutoff frequencies or center frequencies based on those pitches. Okay, now we've got this tuned to the same root note as the original in our quick sampler version. I'm going to load an instance of Snap Heap. And the reason for this is that it allows us to do parallel processing. As it originally shows up, it's a bunch of serial buses. So one lane goes through the processes in the first lane, it moves over to the second, goes through whatever modules are in there, to the third, et cetera, et cetera. But we're going to switch these to parallel, which means that each lane is its own processing based on the original input signal. I'm going to turn these off because every time we do this, we're going to add essentially another copy of it. The gain will get out of hand pretty quickly. But let's add a filter. Just your basic filter. I'm going to use bandpass filters in this example. Again, Q is the sharpness of the filter. You can change the slope if you want a narrower band. But now we're going to add a note modulator. And first we're going to set cutoff frequency of this to A440 because that's the root note that the note modulator is set to. We're going to modulate the cutoff filter 100%. And that means that that particular filter frequency will directly reflect the key that we're pressing on the keyboard. So if I hit a middle C, we get a middle C. Octave above that, we get the C above that. Below, we get above that. And you can hear we're getting a very narrow band of the original sample through that bandpass filter, which is what it's designed to do. But it's creating that same resonant effect of like isolating the pitch and emphasizing it. Now what we're going to do is duplicate. So we have this map. We're going to duplicate this filter, turn on this bus lane, and now we've got two copies. We're going to change the center frequency of this bandpass filter to an octave above the first for our second order harmonic. So 880. Now we've got two harmonics for whatever note we play. And if I play with the gain amount of this second filter, you hear a slight shift in color. And we can keep going. So let's duplicate this again. Turn on this bus. And in order to figure out what our fifth is, I'm going to hop over to this frequency calculator. A5 was our second order harmonic, so we're going to do E6. So that's our 5th frequency. Now we've got our 3rd order harmonic. We'll do it again. Grab the frequency for D, which would be our 4th above this. So we're going to get D7, make that the cutoff for this filter. And we'll do one more. And so that would be, if we want our 3rd, it would be a C sharp. Okay, so now we've got resonant filters on the 1st harmonic, 2nd harmonic, 3rd harmonic, 4th harmonic, 5th harmonic, and we've got this. And again, you can you don't have to focus on the overtone series for tuning these filters. You could also just make use of even overtones if you want something. People commonly think those sound more musical, or odd harmonics if you want more distorted or bitey type sounds. Playing with the amplitude of these filters and the gain of each of these buses can completely change the shape and sound. But now we've got something that sounds pretty tonal no matter what key you play. I'll note that playing chords doesn't always work. The note modulator gets confused at times. It's not a true polyphonic effect that we're creating here. So if you wanted to create a sampler instrument with this, what I would do is then sample notes at a particular interval for a period of time. So like, I don't know, in fifths. Etc. And then you'd have a more complex instrument with the stuff at the end. Moving on to the spectral processing of stuff to bring out tonal characteristics. One of the most conventional processes for doing this is through a vocoder, the effect made popular through groups like Daft Punk. It's not always my favorite because you can get a lot of artifacts with this effect. It has a particular sound to it that tends to lend itself very well to vocals. But essentially the way it works is so we're back to our quick sample version of the instrument. And I've got a copy of mVocoder loaded as a plugin insert on that track. The way this works is that there's a modulator signal and a carrier signal. The modulator is another source. In this case, I'm going to use a piano because I don't want to use a voice, but can be anything. Basically, you just need to route that signal to the sidechain input of your vocoder plugin. And then you've got the carrier, which is our sample that we've been working with, which will be sculpted by the sidechain input based on a number of frequency bands that is contained within this vocoder. So let's just enable this guy. I've got a Noir piano sample loaded as a sidechain input. Okay, so now it's hard to describe what's happening because I can't put it into words. Clearly, I'm taking many stabs at this, but basically the output from the track is now, the content is from the sample that we've been using, but it's being filtered through the sound of the piano sample that's on the sidechain input. And you can hear it mostly through like the envelope of the piano. As the natural decay of the piano notes starts to fade out, you hear our sample die. Whereas if we just turn this off, the sample is set to loop and we'll just hear it indefinitely. But with this on, there's a natural decay, and the tonal quality is kind of shaped in the fashion of a piano now. There's a lot of settings in here, and all the settings in your vocoder will be different. One thing that is usually pretty common, the resolution of the vocoder, so how many frequency bands it's breaking the carrier into to reconstruct based on the sidechain input. So right now it's set to 25, and this one, I don't even really know what that number reflects, but as we increase this number, we should hear more fidelity ultimately. So let's put it up something high, like 90. This whitening effect is supposed to supply some more high frequency information. Anyway, you can hear the artifacts. This is why I'm not a huge fan of this, but it does do a good job of tonicizing noisy material. So here again, just one last comparison. Here's with a low number of frequency bands that it's breaking the signal up into. Versus when this is higher up. So the piano is not a super complex signal. If it were a voice, maybe we'd hear a lot more change in character as we increase the number of filter bands. But anyway, this is just one way of spectrally processing an input sample using a sidechain input from another instrument to kind of shape it in the character of that other instrument. Let's turn that off and let's move over to another way of doing this, which is a really fun way suggested to me by a friend, which is through a copy of Soothe 2. So in this instance, we're going to do a similar type of thing. We're going to use Soothe in a non-traditional fashion. So we're going to first set our sidechain input to that same piano, and then we're going to just have a very broadband effect by creating a couple bell filters and spreading it across the frequency spectrum. So now we've got a sidechain. We're going to turn on the sidechain. So if we audition it, you can hear the pianos coming through. All right, so let's turn the audition off. Now, if we play these two together and turn up the depth, you can see Soothe is doing its normal thing of reducing resonant frequencies based on that sidechain input because we've got it turned on. We're going to turn this into delta mode. Rather than hearing the reductions that Soothe would normally make based on the resonant frequencies of our sidechain input, we're going to only hear those resonant frequencies once we enter delta mode. So now that this is on, you can hear we're getting essentially spectral filtering of our original sample based on the frequency response of that piano. So it's another, almost the same thing that we're doing with the vocoder, just a different plugin, different mechanism. But this has a lot of flexibility to it that makes it a little more user-friendly. Just Soothe is a really great interface, and it's less robotic, which is typically the character of a vocoder for me. You can hear it's very spectrally, filtery, watery kind of sound, but it is a way, again, to coax out the tonal quality inherent in a very noisy sample. And you can, because it's Soothe, you've got a mix control, which allows you to blend in some of the original signal. Now we're going to take a look at one example of using ring modulation, which is the third bucket that I mentioned. I'm borrowing this idea from Nest Acoustics, who's this really fantastic Instagram follow. I would suggest you check it out. So we're going to load up an instance of Serum. Can I make this bigger? I can. Nice. All right, we're going to turn off oscillator A, we're going to turn on oscillator C. We're going to load our sample into this oscillator, which I don't really know how to do, but we'll figure it out. Okay, I don't know how to use Serum that well, but we've got sample tuned and it's looping forward then reverse, which is the smoothest thing I can do. If somebody knows how to add crossfades to looping samples in Serum, put it in the comments below. Okay, we are going to route that to our filter. I'm going to turn on the filter and we're going to find a comb. Comb filters are great for creating harmonic resonances, which is what we were doing before. So if we put this to 440 and we key track it, turn up the resonance. I'm going to tune this filter by ear because it's working better that way. Okay, so now we've got our sample running into a resonant comb filter inside of Serum. And we're going to turn oscillators A back on. We're going to switch over to a sine wave. And we're going to actually turn off the output from the filter. So we can no longer hear our sample being played back. Now we're just getting the sine wave. So now what we're going to do is select ring mod from the filter 1, which is the one we're using. Now that the sine wave is being ring modded by the output of the filter, as we turn that knob up, the sine wave will more and more mimic the timbral characteristics of the original sample, which is run through a resonating comb filter. So we're kind of combining our original additive synthesis method using a resonating filter, but now we're modulating a sine wave based on that signal, which should give us a slightly different tonal characteristic. This is really great because you have the ability to kind of balance between tonal versus noise with a single knob, which is really cool, which you can also, obviously, because we're in Serum, you can modulate using any of the built-in modulators, the LFOs, the envelopes. Now that we are modulating the sine wave using the output of the filter, we can use all these auxiliary warp functions within Serum, which is pretty neat. There's filters, there's distortions. So for instance, and these are all per voice apparently, so it's polyphonic effects, which is super cool. And again, because we're in Serum, we can use any of these LFOs to kind of modulate these effects on the fly, which is just so powerful. Anyway, so maybe a little more out there in terms of the output, but super cool for finding like original signal generators for your synthesizers. And just as a reminder, this is where we started. So just to recap, we looked at additive synthesis using resonant filters to reinforce frequencies and the overtone series that are already inherent in a sample like the one that we're looking at. We looked at spectral processing in order to kind of shape the timbral characteristics of a sample like this using a sidechain input from another instrument and doing that through either a vocoder or something like Soothe 2. And then lastly, we looked at an example using Serum ring modding a sine wave, basically reconstructing our original sample using a tonal thing, which we have very flexible balance control over, and then the ability to do additional per voice processing using any of the cool distortions, filters, etc. that Serum has baked in. So I hope you enjoyed that little walkthrough, something a little different, something a little more informal. If you like content like this, if you like composing, original music, sound design, and just general audio production, be sure to like and subscribe so you get to see when I put new stuff out. And yeah, keep your eye out for the next instrument, which will feature a bunch of friction mallets on weird percussion stuff coming soon. All right, thanks for watching. Catch you next time.